This class isn't for farm kids. Get out. Fall of 1972. Cambridge wore its autumn like a hushed cathedral, red gold leaves whispering underfoot, the old brick walls of Harvard misted by the breath of morning. Two figures pushed a creaky wooden cart past Dunster House, a tall, sun-darkened man in a faded denim jacket, and a boy, maybe 16, trailing behind with a worn leather notebook clutched to his chest like scripture. They weren't students. They weren't faculty. They were traders. Milk and eggs from a Kansas farm, bartered weekly for a few dollars from students too rich to notice the hands that fed them. Walter Allen, the father, knocked on door 42. A half-asleep philosophy major took the crate of eggs, handed over a pocketful of loose bills without a word, and shut the door. James, the boy, lingered. He gazed around the courtyard like a pilgrim seeing Jerusalem for the first time. Stone arches, vines crawling along weathered iron, and then a door slightly ajar. No sign, no guard. Just a faint golden light spilling into the hallway and a smell of chalk dust, warm wood, and thought. He stepped inside. It was a lecture hall. Long oak benches curved toward a blackboard that spanned the wall like a canvas of riddles. A tall man in a dark vest moved silently across the front, writing in clean, sharp strokes. But S. Symbols James had only glimpsed in library books his father borrowed years ago. James sat quietly at the back, heart thumping like a calf before its first storm. But peace didn't last long. A student turned, then another, then the professor himself. They looked at James like he'd tracked manure onto a church carpet. "Hey, that kid's covered in dirt. Did someone leave the barn door open?" Polite laughter. Sharp, well-fed. The professor paused his lecture. His voice was gravel and precision. "This class isn't for farm kids. Get out." James didn't move. He stared at the blackboard. One of the students leaned forward. "You lost, kid? This isn't the janitor's closet." Another chuckled. "Smells like hay." James opened his notebook. The first page bore his father's handwriting, scrawled in careful ink. "Numbers don't lie, Jimmy, even when people do." He sat down. Professor Milton Barringer was not a man fond of interruptions, or charity. A legend in applied mathematics, known for solving the non-linear oscillation in laminar fluid flow. Cold, controlled, brutal in peer reviews. He glared at James with surgical disapproval. "Fine. Sit. You'll be gone in 10 minutes. The chalk resumed its dance. Symbols returned to life across the board. James watched as though the walls were breathing. He scribbled in his notebook, slow and steady, his fingers tracing every curve of each equation as if memorizing the face of a loved one. The Navier-Stokes partial differential equation. He'd read about it in a 1946 farming journal used to prop up their barn window. His father had found the page and said, "Looks like wind." To most, this was graduate-level abstraction. To James, it was weather patterns, irrigation flows, the rhythm of a windmill. To James, math had smell and sound and gravity. When the class ended, students filed out without looking back. James stood up last, closed his notebook, dusted the hay from his sleeves. Professor Barringer stood near the door, adjusting his glasses without looking at the boy. "Curiosity is dangerous, son, especially when it gives you hope." James nodded, not in shame, but like a quiet farewell to the board. In the hallway, Walter waited with the now empty crate. "Where'd you wander off to?" James looked back toward the classroom, now dark and closed again. "Someplace I didn't belong, but needed to hear." Walter didn't reply, just watched his son's face, saw in it the same fire he once had, before life traded his scholarship for soil and sweat. As they walked past the ivy and stone, James pulled out his notebook. On the next blank page he wrote, "Math is listening, not boasting." And in his chest, under the ache of embarrassment and cold, something warm had started to burn. Not anger, not shame, but the beginning of something unshakable. James had opened the wrong door. But maybe, just maybe, it had opened to the right room. 3 days passed. James didn't return to the classroom right away. He spent his evenings back home on the farm, walking the fields with a flashlight tucked into his coat, whispering equations under his breath as he stepped over furrows and fence posts. The cows didn't mind. Neither did the moon. But the board wouldn't leave him alone. The symbols, those curls of chalk and silence, clung to his mind like the smell of hay to denim. And so, on a gray Thursday morning, James told his father he needed to make another delivery. This time, he entered the classroom 15 minutes early. It was empty, but not quiet. The chalkboard still bore remnants of yesterday's lecture, unfinished, incomplete. James sat in the back again, notebook open, pencil ready. He didn't come to belong. He came to learn. The door creaked. Students filed in. Some recognized him. He's back? Maybe he thinks this is a movie. But no one asked him to leave. Not yet. And then, once again, Professor Barringer appeared. Dark suit, silver hair, and the air of a man who considered gravity optional, except when teaching. He didn't look at James. But this time he wrote something on the board without introduction. A new equation. A complex, unsolved variant of the Goldbach conjecture, a problem that had defied resolution for over 2 centuries. Most versions asked whether every even number greater than 2 could be expressed as the sum of 2 primes. This, however, was different. It wasn't a question. It was a trap. A twisted, conditional form incorporating sequences of modular arithmetic, prime gaps, and Mobius transformations. Barringer capped his chalk, turned to the class, and with a faint smile said, "Even our graduate students haven't touched this. But perhaps our guest, Farmer, has a thought." Some students chuckled. Others waited, intrigued. James looked up from his notebook. His pencil hadn't moved. "It's not meant to be solved in one sitting," a tall student muttered. "It's just to humble you." James tilted his head. He wasn't angry. He was listening. He stood, walked slowly to the front. And while no one breathed, he reached into his coat, pulled out a dull piece of chalk, and wrote. Not on the center of the board. Not over the professor's clean equation. He walked to the far edge of the blackboard, near the windows where the chalk dust gathered like winter frost, and started sketching not an answer, but a question. A side route, a proof by contradiction, a modular identity built from lattice logic. Students leaned forward. One whispered, "Wait, that's the Hardy-Littlewood circle method." But James didn't speak. He kept writing for 4 minutes, and then, softly, under his breath, he said, "The structure breaks at the 4th conditional. It assumes symmetry across non-trivial zeros." The room fell quiet. Even Barringer didn't speak. James stepped back, wiped his hands, and returned to his seat. His boots squeaked slightly on the old floor. He didn't bow, didn't smile. He just sat down and opened his notebook again. No one said anything for a full 30 seconds. Then, a student named Will, a second-year doctoral candidate in number theory, stood up, walked to the board, and stared. He pointed to the last 2 lines. He found the contradiction. In the Mobius expansion. That's where it breaks. Murmurs. Real ones. not mocking. Professor Barringer slowly walked to the chalkboard, read every line, twice, then cleared his throat. This may be coincidental. A half-formed guess can sometimes resemble truth. But his voice was quieter now. James didn't look up. He wrote one line in his notebook. To listen well is to find what isn't being said. That night, as the sun fell over the Harvard rooftops and the lamplight returned to warm the ancient stone, someone erased the board. But not James's writing. A thin strip of chalk, still clinging to the far right edge, remained. A footprint of something that wasn't supposed to happen. A farm boy had touched the impossible. And the impossible had blinked. It began the way most revelations do. Quietly. The chalk marks James left behind on the far edge of the board hadn't been erased. No one had the nerve. It was Friday morning. The air was crisp, and the lecture hall, once again, filled with the soft murmurs of students flipping pages, tapping pens, whispering half-sure theories about what they had witnessed yesterday. James arrived before any of them. He always did now. Same seat, same boots, same notebook clutched tight like it might fly away if he let go. Only this time his eyes weren't on the professor. They were on the board, the chalk still clinging to the corner. His own writing. He never meant to leave a mark, but it had stayed. Professor Barringer entered at exactly 8:00 a.m., always punctual, always composed. But this time, as he placed his notes on the lectern, he paused. His eyes flicked once toward James, then back to the chalkboard. He didn't mention it, didn't acknowledge it. But the silence that filled the room was different now. Thicker. Heavier. Even the students sensed it. One of them, Will, the number theory grad student, couldn't resist. He stood up, walked slowly to the edge of the board, and stared again at the lines James had written. His fingers followed the final 2 steps. Then he whispered, almost to himself, It's still correct. A few heads turned, then a few more. Someone in the front row leaned back and muttered, Was that really him? Did he actually? And then the room did something Harvard lecture halls don't usually do. It fell completely, utterly silent. You don't expect genius to wear mud-stained jeans. You don't expect it to come with soft eyes and calloused hands. And yet, there it was. No fanfare, no arrogance, just chalk and truth. Professor Barringer cleared his throat. He didn't address James directly. Instead, he turned to the board and began today's lecture like nothing had changed. But something had. He moved quickly through Fourier transforms, faster than usual, perhaps to reassert control, perhaps to forget the ghost of the farm boy's handwriting still visible in the corner. But midway through, he faltered, just for a moment. A pause, a hesitation. He had written a second-order differential step, a transition that would normally be trivial, but today his hand hung mid-air. James raised his pencil, then slowly lowered it. He didn't speak, but Barringer saw it. Their eyes met, briefly. The old man's gaze, sharp as winter, locked with the boy's calm. Then, for the first time in a long time, the professor corrected himself. After class, students lingered. They didn't rush out like usual. They looked around, unsure of how to act. James quietly closed his notebook. A girl in a crimson sweater approached him. Not too close. Her voice cautious. "Hey, what you wrote yesterday. Did someone help you with that?" James shook his head gently. "No." She blinked. "But how did you know?" James looked down at the notebook in his hands, ran his fingers along the weathered spine. I didn't know. I just listened. She tilted her head, confused. Listened to what? He smiled faintly. The silence between the numbers. Then he stood, nodded politely, and left. Outside, the air had turned gold with early October sun. Leaves danced in circles on the stone paths, and James walked with his shoulders a little straighter. Not proud, not defiant. Just sure. Back in the lecture hall, Barringer remained behind, standing alone at the board. He reached into the tray, picked up the eraser, paused, and then, instead of wiping the chalk clean, he boxed James's writing in white, a square frame around the proof fragment. And next to it, he wrote 3 words in clean, old-fashioned cursive. Worth reconsidering later. That night, James wrote one more line in his notebook. The world speaks loud, but math speaks soft. He folded the page, slept early, dreamt of fields and prime numbers. He didn't know it yet. But the silence he left behind was already echoing in places he'd never imagined. No one said it aloud, but the whispers had shifted. In common rooms, between lectures, and even in the quiet corners of the Widener Library, James had a new name now. Not the farm kid, not the mistake, but something colder, sharper. The mascot. It began with a joke. A senior named Ethan, blond, sharp-jawed, son of a Wall Street economist, leaned across his friend's desk and smirked. Let's see how far the prodigy goes when the math turns on him. He wasn't alone. 3 others joined him, students from old families with old money, and even older grudges against anyone who didn't speak the same way or wear the right shoes. One of them, Clara, pretended to laugh, but her voice was clipped when she said, "They're calling him Barringer's shepherd boy now, like he's some math experiment." So they decided. A test. A trap. They crafted it over the weekend. Not a real equation. Not a mistake. But a logical dead end. An elegant-looking construction built on flawed premises, meant to appear solvable but hiding a contradiction within the 4th transformation step. It was the academic version of a rigged game. They printed it on crisp paper. No name. Just, for James. And on Monday morning they slid it across the desk to him before class. James took it without a word. Ethan leaned close, smiling with teeth. A little challenge? Thought you'd enjoy it. James nodded once, opened his notebook, and began. For 10 minutes, the classroom moved around him. Barringer lectured on Fourier analysis. The students took notes. Leaves scraped across the windows in the breeze, but James didn't hear any of it. His pencil scratched gently on the page. He had reached the contradiction and stopped. Then, slowly, James turned the page in his notebook and drew something new. Not a solution. A map. He restructured their equation into a flowchart, built each step into a visual chain, tracing each transformation through logical symmetry. And there, in the middle, like a broken cog in a clock, he circled one term. Then he circled it again, and wrote, "Inconsistent under initial assumption. Self-negating at step 4. Suggest re-evaluation of constraints." He closed the notebook, looked up. The group was watching. Clara tilted her head. "You figured it out?" James simply slid the notebook across the table. She leaned over, reading silently. Her cheeks flushed. Ethan looked, frowned. It wasn't solvable. That's the point. James met his eyes, calm, quiet. Then maybe it wasn't a math problem. Just a mirror. By the time class ended, no one was laughing. Will, the doctoral student, glanced over the notes and whispered, "He mapped the contradiction, like a diagnostic." Professor Barringer, hearing the murmurs, finally asked, "Something you'd like to share?" Ethan hesitated. Clara froze. James stood up, walked slowly to the front. He didn't accuse, he didn't name names. He simply unfolded a blank piece of paper and, in front of the class, rewrote the fake equation, but this time marked the contradiction in red chalk, framed with parentheses, and signed at the bottom. Not all problems need solving. Some just need to be seen clearly. J. Allen. He stepped back. Silence again, but not the heavy silence of doubt. This was the silence of something shifting. The trap had failed. And the trappers had learned the cost of underestimating someone who listened deeper than they spoke. But the backlash was not over. Outside, under the shade of the library arches, a man in a corduroy jacket watched. He was Professor Elliot Shaw, head of the university's Merit Scholarship Board. He had heard the rumors, the stories, the impossible equations, the silent farm boy. He wasn't impressed. And later that week, he would send a letter. A cold, formal letter questioning whether James's work was his own, whether perhaps this boy was simply repeating things he didn't understand. A mimic, not a mind. And the next chapter would no longer be about chalk. Before James was the boy with the chalk, before Harvard whispered his name in hallways, before any board framed his equations in white, he was just a boy who followed his father into the fog. Kansas, 6 years earlier. The land was flat enough to break your heart. Wheat fields stretched so far they bled into the sky. Sunrises came slow, like someone pulling back the curtain on another day of hard labor. Walter Allen woke before the crows. Always had. He didn't own much. A weather-worn house, 2 windmills, 7 cows, 4 chickens, and a boy who asked too many questions. That boy followed him everywhere. Why does the windmill turn faster when the sky's heavy? Why do cows lie down before it rains? Why do the shadows move in circles by afternoon? And Walter, tired as he was, never told him to stop. Instead, one morning, after milking the cows in half-light, Walter handed James a notebook, leather-bound, second-hand, empty. "You see patterns others don't," he said. "Write them down. Everyone." James opened the notebook, and on the first page he drew a circle. He labeled it, "Windmill rotation versus sky pressure." He didn't know the word torque yet, but he felt it. Walter had once been a scholar. Briefly. When he was 17, he'd won a local math competition. The prize, a state scholarship to study mechanical engineering. He made it through 2 semesters, long enough to touch calculus, long enough to fall in love with the way equations could explain not just machines, but seasons. But the 3rd semester never came. His father died. The farm slipped into debt. Walter dropped out without protest, without bitterness. Some men shout at the world. He simply went home. He never blamed anyone. But now, when James asked about pressure and levers, he'd light up, not in joy, but in memory. "This," he'd say, placing a wrench against the pump valve, "this is just applied force over area. But the cows don't care what you call it. They just want the water." They worked side by side, in silence, in rhythm. Walter didn't teach James from books. He taught him from weather, from weight, from waiting. How to count the seconds between lightning and thunder. How to estimate slope from the angle of a wheelbarrow. How to listen to the way the barn creaked before a storm. And James, without knowing, was building his own curriculum. One evening, after supper, James asked, "Did you ever wish you hadn't left school?" Walter looked up from the fireplace. He didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, "I used to. But now I think, if I hadn't come back, I wouldn't have heard how the wind speaks to the silo." James frowned. Walter continued, "You know what the difference is between school math and real math?" James shook his head. Walter leaned in, voice almost a whisper. "At school, they test if you can remember the answer. Out here, the question changes every morning." That night, a storm rolled in. The barn moaned in the wind. Rain struck the tin roof like a ticking clock. James lay in bed, unable to sleep. Then he heard it. The windmill turning too fast, faster than it ever had. The squeal of dry bearings. The whine of torque unmeasured. He grabbed his coat, ran barefoot across wet dirt. Walter was already there, lantern in hand. "Didn't think I'd hear you behind me," he said without turning. James blinked at the spinning blades. "The angle's off," he said. "The blade pitch. It's catching more lift than it should." Walter nodded slowly, then turned. "You don't just hear it, do you? You measure it. In your mind." James didn't answer. He didn't need to. Before they went back in, Walter placed a hand on James's shoulder. It was rough, firm. The hand of a man who'd chosen silence over sorrow for many years. Machines may lie, people may lie, but numbers never do. Then after a pause, "Don't let anyone teach you that math belongs to the men in buildings. You already speak its language. Just never stop listening." Years later, in a Harvard lecture hall filled with polished shoes and polished names, when James sat quietly in the back row and was told to leave, he stayed. Not because he was brave, but because he remembered the sound of the windmill that night, the hum of balance and danger and truth, and because he carried, in his coat pocket, a weathered notebook with a circle on the first page, the circle that started it all. It would be about who deserves to be heard. The hallway was a cathedral of echoes at 2:07 a.m. The janitor had long gone. The lights flickered in half-sleep. Most of Harvard slumbered behind oak doors, wrapped in blankets, dreaming of success and legacy and letters of recommendation. But down in the basement of Maxwell Hall, a boy stood before the chalkboard, listening. James had waited all day. He had helped his father unload crates, fixed a leaky pipe, eaten supper in silence. Then he had walked the 4 miles from the farm edge into town, hands in pockets, heart full of something he didn't name. The classroom door creaked. He had the key. Not an official one, but the old latch near the window was loose, just as it had been for decades. He slipped inside, lit one desk lamp, pulled out his notebook, and walked to the board. There were no students, no voices, no pressure, only space. And in that space, a problem. A chalkboard nearly untouched since 1961. On it was written the skeletal outline of a proof attempt, half erased, nearly forgotten, a rare non-linear formulation of the Navier-Stokes equations, embedded in a rotating reference frame. This problem had lived for 70 years, unsolved, unmoving. The Clay Mathematics Institute once offered $1 million for a breakthrough. But here, in the quiet of night, it was not about money. It was about the hum beneath the question. James had seen it once in a forgotten footnote from his father's library copy of Fluid Dynamics for Civil Applications, and it hadn't left his mind since. He picked up the chalk and began. For the first hour, he rewrote the question. Not as it was scribbled in pieces, but as a whole. He aligned the symbols like rows in a field, spacing each term so that it breathed. Ru, tupos, Ryu, Ishis, P, T, Ruffs. He whispered it to himself like a prayer. He moved from there, step by step. Not fast, not frantic. He stopped often, stepped back, walked around the room. It was the way his father had taught him to test a plow, not by pushing it, but by listening to its resistance. At 3:12 a.m., someone else walked past the hall. Lena Cho, a research assistant in computational mathematics, was returning from the lab. Her shift had run long. She had spilled coffee on her code and erased 4 hours of work. She needed silence. Instead, she heard chalk. She peeked through the glass window and froze. A kid, in boots, working like the board was alive. She watched for a full minute before she even blinked. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't copying. He was building. Inside, James stopped at the final term of a stress tensor expansion. He stood still, staring at it like a strange animal in a field. Then he turned to the side of the board and wrote a single line. Assume symmetry breaks at viscous dissipation threshold when approaching boundary discontinuity. Then another line. Then a diagram. An internal vortex loop hidden within low Reynolds flow. And finally, a phrase his father once said beside the barn wall. If you want the river to speak, dam it gently. He turned it into math, into a constraint, into a footnote of his own. Lena opened the door softly. James turned, just slightly. I'll erase it, he said. I just needed to see it out loud. Lena blinked. No. Don't erase it. She walked forward. Her voice changed from suspicion to awe. How long have you been working on this? James shrugged, looked at his notebook. Since I was 12. Lena studied the board again. This wasn't mimicry. It wasn't luck. This was a kind of mathematical breathing, slow, deliberate, internalized. You're not supposed to be here, she said. James nodded. I know. A pause. But neither is this problem. It doesn't belong in a drawer. By morning, a rumor had already begun. The farm boy stays at 2 a.m. Not everyone believed it. Some dismissed it as student legend. Others thought it romantic fiction. But a few professors began to check the board before sunrise, just in case. And what they found, what James left behind night after night, wasn't a solution yet. But it was a direction. And that, in the world of impossible equations, was sometimes even rarer. That evening, James wrote quietly in his notebook, "The world sleeps, but the board waits." And across town, in a coffee-stained lab report, Lena had already written a note of her own. We may be looking in the wrong direction, or perhaps the right mind is finally looking. Harvard held its International Mathematics Symposium every 2 years. A grand affair. Velvet banners, silver name tags, coffee brewed too bitter in 2 small paper cups, and minds that could bend time into curves on paper. This year, the keynote would be attended by world-class theorists, visiting from Berlin, Kyoto, Geneva, São Paulo. And in the back corner of Maxwell Hall's 4th-floor office, an unregistered farm boy was told he could not attend. Closed to the public, said the admin. Only graduate-level access. James nodded. Didn't argue. Didn't plead. He left quietly. But not before he tucked a worn page from his notebook, containing a narrowed constraint on Navier-Stokes symmetry, into his coat pocket. Later that night, Will, the doctoral student who had once doubted him, found James near the bike racks. It was cold, windy. Will scratched his neck awkwardly. "You're not going tomorrow?" James shrugged. "I'm not supposed to be there." Will hesitated, then offered a sly smile. "Then let's not go in through the front." Saturday morning. Maxwell Auditorium was filled wall to wall. Projectors flickered. Notebooks opened like quiet wings. Professors leaned forward. Undergrads sat on the floor. And among them, hidden behind a row of tall chairs, James sat. No name tag, no invitation, just quiet eyes. His heart beat slowly, not with nerves, but with that familiar feeling. The board was about to speak. The presentation was titled, "A Novel Constraint Approach on Dissipative Flow Dynamics Within Navier-Stokes." The speaker? Dr. Adrian Mallory, Associate Professor, Rising Star, and, until 2 weeks ago, head of the department's research cohort. He walked to the podium, handsome and composed, and spoke in crisp, effortless tones. James watched closely. Slide 1, Slide 2, Slide 3. Each one familiar, not in language. Mallory had changed that, not in format. The graphs were colored, cleaned, dressed up. But the core idea, the hidden vortex loop within boundary layer turbulence, was his. James had drawn it 3 months ago, in the corner of the midnight board. Mallory had seen it, pretended to forget it. And now, here it was. "We postulate," Mallory declared, pointing to a diagram, "that dissipation thresholds form internal symmetry breaks at sub-Reynolds intervals," James whispered under his breath, "as pressure approaches discontinuity. That's not your line." No one heard him, except Lena. She turned, mouth slightly open. "Wait, James." But he raised a hand, gentle, still. Let him finish. At the final slide, the crowd applauded. Some stood. A Nobel-nominated guest from Tokyo asked a question. Mallory answered with ease. The moderator smiled. "Genius work," he said. "Bold approach." James stood, not to shout, but to walk down the aisle, notebook in hand. The room noticed. One by one, heads turned. Whispers rose. "Is that the farm boy? What's he doing here?" Mallory stiffened. James reached the chalkboard next to the projector screen. Didn't look at Mallory. Didn't address the crowd. He opened his notebook. Found the original sketch. Redrew it. Exactly as he had the first night he saw it in his mind. Then, beneath it, added one line. "If boundary dissipation holds, flow divergence should decay, not rise." He underlined the word decay. Then he turned to Mallory. "You left this out. It's the difference between a model and a solution." The room held its breath. Mallory opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the board, back at the notebook. His face, once so carefully arranged, cracked just slightly. One of the foreign professors raised a hand. "Where is that from?" James looked at him, voice calm. "My barn wall. The first version was written in charcoal." Laughter, soft, genuine, rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "This equation isn't for kids?" And another replied, "Then why could only a kid solve it?" Mallory stepped back, didn't deny it, didn't defend it. He knew. And worse, so did the room. The moderator called for a short break. As people rose to stretch and whisper, James quietly left. Not through the front, not in victory. He had no name tag to remove, no paper to publish, no panel to join. But as he stepped into the cold morning light, Will caught up to him. "You should be furious," Will said. James shook his head. He needed the applause. Will frowned. "And you don't?" James looked toward the sky, pale clouds, soft sun. "I've had enough applause from the wind." That night, someone added a new line of graffiti near the lecture hall entrance. Not crass, not crude, just chalk written on stone. Truth doesn't need permission to walk in the room. And beside it, a quiet drawing, a windmill turning. The conference break lasted 15 minutes. Just enough time for whispers to spread like wildfire. By the time attendees returned to their seats, no one was talking about the official keynote anymore. They were talking about the boy, the boots, the notebook, the missing line, the correction. Dr. Adrian Mallory did not return to the stage. Instead, a panel of professors, curious, cautious, gathered around the chalkboard, examining James's amendment. Their brows furrowed not in disbelief, but in recognition. One whispered, "That's the missing decay function." Another, "He didn't just correct it, he refined the model." Lena Cho stood nearby, arms crossed, guarding James's notebook like a holy relic. Then someone from the panel cleared their throat and said, "Can the young man, James Allen, please return to the front?" James was standing in the back, still, quiet, waiting. He walked forward again. No applause. Just the hush that happens before revelation. A chair was offered. He didn't sit. A mic was offered. He shook his head. Instead, he walked to the board, erased the entire bottom half of Mallory's copied proof, and with clean, practiced strokes, rewrote it. Not fast, not slow. The room watched the chalk move like a conductor's baton. James spoke only once. "You can't force fluid to obey an equation. You have to let it teach you the boundary." He added two final lines. U equals 0, but only if PT respects localized collapse near boundary layer interference. Someone in the front gasped. That was it. That was the piece that had eluded researchers for 70 years. It didn't solve everything, but it solved where to begin. The board fell silent. Then the room erupted. First soft, then louder. Not polite applause. Real, stunned, reluctant wonder. Even the most hardened academics stood. One professor from ETH Zurich simply murmured, "He just reframed the problem. Completely." A guest from MIT whispered, "We've been asking the wrong question since 1954. Someone, no one knew who, stood up and said clear and true, "This equation isn't for kids." A pause. Then why could only a kid solve it? At the edge of the stage, Dr. Mallory stared at the board. He didn't speak. He didn't stay. He turned, coat stiff, and walked out through the side exit, swallowed by his own silence. James didn't turn to watch him go. Instead, he stepped back from the board, dusted his hands, and gently closed the cap of the chalk. Outside, the sky was beginning to rain. Soft, gentle. James walked down the stone steps. Will caught up beside him, holding an umbrella. "You just humiliated a tenured professor," Will said. James blinked. "I didn't mean to." "Then what did you mean to do?" James looked up at the clouds, lips moving like he was reciting a number. Correct a mistake, and let the board speak again. Will was quiet a moment. Then, without looking at him, You're not just solving equations, are you? James finally smiled. No. I'm finishing my father's conversation with the wind. The next morning, every chalkboard in Maxwell Hall bore the same anonymous phrase, scrawled in perfect cursive. Truth does not tremble when spoken by quiet voices. And beneath it, smaller. J. Allen. Unofficially, of course. For one weekend, James Allen became a ghost legend. Not in tabloids, not on TV, but in the chalk dust behind classroom doors, in whispers between office walls, in the nervous quiet of professors who now ask themselves, what if he's not an accident? But academia, like all kingdoms, does not surrender thrones easily. Monday morning. A memo circulated, unsigned. Concerning the recent presentation attributed to an unauthorized individual, allegations suggest material may have been adapted from uncredited archival notes. No name, no proof. But the accusation was planted. Professor Elliot Shaw, head of the Merit Scholarship Board, had seen enough. Genius without structure is danger, he said. This boy didn't earn the room he stood in. And so, a faculty hearing was called. Not to honor James, to question him, and to bury him politely. The room was cold and windowless, wood-paneled walls, formal ties, folded hands, sharp eyes. At the center, one desk, a chair. A nameplate written in chalk, James Allen, independent, no degree, no transcript, no credentials, only a notebook. A projector was set up. The committee displayed Mallory's original presentation, then James's handwritten corrections, then excerpts from an obscure French thesis, 1939, suggesting a vaguely similar constraint. Could you have read this, James? One professor asked. James flipped open his notebook, revealed a page. Found it in a Kansas silo, torn copy, covered in grease. I couldn't read the footnotes. Lena Cho raised a hand, but he didn't repeat it. He refuted it. He corrected the flaws in it. A professor snorted. Correction implies access. James looked down at his hands. Rough, faint scars from fencing wire. He said nothing. Then the door opened, and Walter Allen stepped in. He wore a faded denim jacket, still stained with barn dust. Boots worn through at the heels. No one asked for his ID. He walked to the front, took off his cap. I'm James's father, he said simply. I taught him numbers before he could count stars. Shaw frowned. This is a closed hearing. Walter looked at him, not angry, just tired of silence. He stepped beside his son, laid a hand on the back of James's chair and said, You're asking if he stole this knowledge, but knowledge ain't a coin you pass hand to hand. A pause. You ever sat in a barn while your cows breathe against frost? Heard the wind through silo slats? Watched a boy stand up during storms to measure how fast the rain leans? No one answered. Walter held up a folded paper, the first diagram James ever drew, a windmill rotating too fast with a pencil-sketched torque arrow. He didn't borrow knowledge, he lives it. Silence. Shaw muttered, Even lived knowledge needs credentials. Walter smiled faintly. So does a tractor need a diploma before it turns the soil? Someone coughed. Someone else stood. The debate turned, softly, toward James's record, not his resume, his work, his originality. The professor from Zurich, watching silently all this time, finally spoke. What matters is not where he came from. It's that he sees the question we stopped seeing. A pause. Then, I'd like to sponsor his admission, independent or not. By the end of the hearing, the verdict was not shouted. It came quietly, respectfully. James would be recognized as a special independent scholar, allowed to audit courses, contribute to research, and submit his own findings. He would not receive grades. He would not walk at graduation. But he would walk among the chalkboards unshackled. As they left the building, Walter looked at his son. I didn't say much in there. James shook his head. You said everything. Then, after a long pause, Walter asked, Are you going to stay here forever? James thought, then smiled. No. Just long enough to finish listening. That night, someone erased the word unauthorized from James's chalkboard note outside the lecture hall and replaced it with unconventional but undeniable. And for the first time, the hallway stayed quiet, not because no one cared, but because everyone finally did. Summer came to Kansas like a hymn. The wheat fields shimmered gold beneath skies too big for ceilings, and the wind turned the old windmill slow and steady, like it was keeping time with a memory. On a quiet morning, a rusted pickup truck rolled down the gravel road, kicked up a trail of dust, and stopped beside a barn with a crooked roof. James stepped out, same boots, same notebook in his hand, and a new blackboard. It wasn't made of slate. It wasn't even black. Just an old wooden panel, once the side wall of the cattle stall, now scrubbed clean and coated with dark paint. He'd nailed it up himself the night he returned. The first time he touched it with chalk, he paused, not to think, to listen. Then he wrote, in large, slow strokes, U equals 0, and under it, don't chase the answer. Listen for the question. Within a week, 7 kids showed up, all from nearby farms, some barefoot, some shy. One had a stutter. They came because their parents said, he's the boy who made Harvard listen. They came not for grades, but because, like him, they wanted to understand why rain leaned sideways before storms, why the tractor dipped on certain slopes, why the shadows of birds flew faster in some winds. James didn't teach from a textbook. He taught with cows breathing in the distance, with fence wire and irrigation pipes, with pencil stubs and circles drawn in dust. He taught like his father once had, quietly, without ceremony. And far away in Cambridge, someone else was teaching too, Professor Barringer, now older, slower, a touch softer. He had never said sorry aloud. But his students noticed that, one day, he erased the last theorem of the semester and instead wrote, Genius doesn't ask where you're from, only if you listen. Then he drew a windmill beside it. The room fell silent, as it always had when James was near. In Kansas, James built new boards, one on the back of the chicken coop, one in the shed. He called them listening walls. When kids solved a proof, they didn't present it. They wrote it on the wood, left it overnight, and let the wind read it first. Then in the morning, they erased it and began again. Because truth, James said, isn't what you show off. It's what you're willing to let go of and still carry. One evening, under the orange wash of sunset, James sat on the porch with his father. Walter was older now, still strong, but his hands trembled a little more when lifting the mug. They watched the kids run back down the hill, dust rising in their wake. Did you ever think, Walter asked, you'd come back here? James smiled. I never left, just borrowed a few questions. Walter looked at the barn, where the old windmill creaked like an old man stretching. "They'll be all right," he said. James nodded. "They already are." That night, James stayed in the barn after dark. He lit a single lantern, took a new piece of chalk, faced the wall, and wrote, "Dad, the wind still talks, and I'm still listening." In the morning, the board was clean. The wind had read it. The cows didn't say a word. But somewhere in the dust, on a Kansas farm without a gate, a genius was planting questions like seeds, not for applause, but for harvests no one had named yet. Thank you for staying until the end of this quiet story. A story without spotlights, without applause at the start. Just a boy in muddy boots, holding his father's worn notebook, walking into a world of chalk and doubt. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever learned in silence while others spoke loud, if you've ever taught someone not with words, but with patience, then this story was always yours. Thank you for walking this road with us. Thank you for believing that sometimes the brightest minds are born far from the spotlight. And if you leave this story today with a heart just a little softer, then maybe the blackboard is still writing inside all of us, inside.